Sometime around 2023, a philosopher named Emerson Green sat down to write an essay. He's agnostic, he hosts a show called Counter-Apologetics, reads Plantinga, debates William Lane Craig, and generally spends his time poking holes in religious arguments. The essay that he was writing was supposed to answer a question that Sam Harris had basically already settled for a lot of people in skeptic circles. Is Mormonism the least plausible form of Christianity? The argument goes that Mormonism is Christianity plus some weird extra things, so obviously worse. But Emerson decided to actually check. He read the critics, read the defenses, and worked through the philosophy. And his answer was no. He said that LDS theology, specifically because of what it removes from classical Christianity, is actually among the more philosophically defensible options on the table. He's not converting, but he followed the argument to where it led. I did something similar for almost 15 years, just through a different door. And I've talked a little bit about myself before, but I came in through history and archaeology rather than philosophy. A little bit more backstory, I am an Army veteran, and I came back from war, I went through some stuff, and eventually I started following all the different threads that I could find on ancient religion, textual history, and Near Eastern archaeology. I wasn't even really specifically looking for faith, I was just following the evidence. And what I kept running into is that the things that serious thinkers find the most objectionable about mainstream Christianity actually start disappearing the further back in time that you go. There was no creation from nothing in the ancient sources, there was no abstract philosophical God in the oldest texts, and there was no eternal torment in the earliest Christian writers. I didn't go looking for the church, but I got here because that's where the evidence was pointing. And Emerson and I aren't the only ones. There are countless philosophers, historians, cosmologists, and biblical scholars who have followed their disciplines and ended up at the same place. None of them are LDS, and none of them are doing us any favors. That's what this episode is about. Before we get into it, I do want to say something about how the channel works, and if you're familiar with the channel and my sourcing and my citations, go ahead and skip ahead. If you're unfamiliar, I do put all of my sources in the description of every episode, all of them, because there's a pattern. When someone doesn't cite sources, the response is just that they're uninformed or uneducated or making things up, and that's a reasonable standard. But even when the sources are cited, something kind of funny happens. If the source is LDS, it simply gets dismissed as biased. That's fair. If the source is a Christian scholar, then it just gets dismissed as religious by the atheists. And if the source is an agnostic or an atheist scholar who just happens to confirm something that supports LDS theology, that usually gets dismissed too, without any specific counter-argument, just a general sense that the source can't be trusted because the conclusion doesn't fit their paradigm. At some point, the game becomes unfalsifiable. No source will ever be acceptable because the conclusion has already been decided. So here's what I try to do instead. I try to use as wide a variety of sources as I can. In the past, I've used Protestant theologians, Catholic historians, Orthodox Jewish manuscript scholars, agnostic New Testament critics, secular archaeologists, academic philosophers, all with no religious stake whatsoever, and in some cases, people who set out specifically to disprove the things that I'm about to show you, just to name a few. The sources in this episode today span every major religious tradition. They disagree with each other on plenty of things, but what they have in common is that their work, done independently in different fields and for different reasons, keeps pointing in the same direction. If your response is just to dismiss all of them, that's your right. But again, at that point, you're just protecting a conclusion. One more thing before we go. If you're just here to angrily comment without watching or checking sources, first off, thanks for the engagement. But seriously, you don't have to believe this evidence is conclusive, and you don't have to accept LDS conclusions specifically. But this episode is built on the testimony of scholars who have absolutely no interest in defending the church. That's worth at least hearing out, right? Either way, my name is Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard. So people often ask me personally what evidence I found before I ever investigated the church. What was I actually looking for, and what did I find? So, just to be clear from the very start, I've been aware of the church my whole life, but until I reached my 30s, I wasn't studying the LDS church. I wasn't investigating the claims or evaluating Joseph Smith. I really wasn't interested in Christianity at all. I was a veteran coming out of a hard time, and what I was looking for was something that was true and something real, not something comforting and not something that fit a worldview that I already had or was familiar with. But I was looking for something that held back when you actually pushed on it. So I started following the archaeological and the textual record of the ancient world. Because, as I've mentioned before, the ancient world really doesn't care what you want to find, it just shows you what's there. What I kept finding is that the further back in time you go, the more that the ancient record lines up with things that classical Christianity either doesn't teach anymore or actively pushes against. One concept that kept showing up, and this did surprise me at first, is what the scholars call the divine council, and now I talk about it all the time. This is the idea that the God of Israel presided over a heavenly assembly of divine beings, not unlike a royal court. Before I explain why this matters, let me explain what I mean by divine beings. I don't mean angels like from the Hallmark store, and not metaphors for human judges, which is the most common deflection that you hear. But the Hebrew term is Elohim, which is the plural form of the word used for God throughout the Old Testament. And in these texts, it refers to members of a supernatural assembly. Psalm 82 opens with, God stands in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. Psalm 29 calls on the Bene Elim, sons of El, divine beings, to worship Yahweh. And Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8, in its original form, assigns the nations of the earth to members of this council. This is the version from Michael Heiser, a Protestant scholar with a PhD in Hebrew Bible from the University of Wisconsin, who spent his career making this case in mainstream academic settings. His argument is that later interpreters imposed the monotheist reading onto texts that were written within a divine council framework, and that the anthropomorphisms in the Hebrew Bible, like God walking in a garden, wrestling with Jacob, and sitting enthroned, are not metaphors that can just be explained away. They reflect a very different picture of divinity than what the creeds describe. The creedal God, abstract, impassible, and without body or parts, was in fact a philosophical development that came later. The ancient sources describe something different. So here's what I mean. Deuteronomy chapter 32 is a good test case. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest manuscript tradition that we have, predating the standard Hebrew text by over 1,000 years, reads, When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. The broader passage then goes on to say that Yahweh took Israel as his own portion, while these other divine beings received the other nations. It's a coherent and cohesive theological picture, a council of divine beings, each with a domain, with Yahweh presiding over all and claiming Israel directly. Your Bible almost certainly says sons of Israel instead of sons of God, and that's not a mistranslation. It's a full-on substitution in the underlying text. Emanuel Tove, an Orthodox Jewish scholar who edited the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project with no stake in any Christian or LDS debate, documented this as well. The original text was changed, and the reason that it was changed is theologically motivated. Sons of God implies a divine council, and by the time the standard Hebrew text was compiled, that theology was being actively suppressed. This isn't just a single verse, it's one documented example of a larger pattern of deliberate theological editing. The same pattern that Frank Moore-Cross at Harvard spent his career documenting across the Deuteronomistic history. The LDS Church wasn't my hypothesis when I started, but it was where the evidence kept pointing. And when I finally looked at LDS theology seriously, the Book of Mormon's picture of God as embodied, relational, and presiding over a council of divine beings, that actually maps onto the pre-edited tradition, not the edited one. Lehi's vision in 1 Nephi describes God enthroned and surrounded by his council in a way that matches the structural features of the divine council vision genre, the exact same features present in Isaiah 6, 1 Kings 22, and texts found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830, but the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't discovered until 1947. The Ugaritic texts that confirmed the ancient Near Eastern divine council framework weren't found until 1929. And Heiser's scholarly work on the divine council in the Hebrew Bible wasn't published until 2015. Joseph had no access to any of that specific scholarship that would confirm any of these connections. And the theology that he described matches what those sources show the original tradition actually looked like before it was edited out. But beyond theology, the Book of Mormon's specific geographical and textual claims have also been confirmed by scholarship that came long after Joseph Smith. And these deserve to be treated as separate types of evidence. And we've talked about many of them before, so let's just cover them kind of quickly. The Nahom inscriptions are considered geographical, where ancient South Arabian tribal markers bearing the consonantal root NHM were found on altars at a site in Yemen in the 1990s by German archaeologists, dated to around the 5th and 6th centuries BC, placing the name in exactly the location and period that the Book of Mormon describes. A critic can try to say that place names just get preserved across time, and the match could be a coincidence. But what makes it harder to dismiss is that the text doesn't just mention the name, it specifies the direction of travel to get there, the death and burial of Ishmael at that location, and then a specific eastward turn toward a place called Bountiful. The Book of Mormon describes Bountiful as a fertile coastal area capable of supporting shipbuilding. That alone is an unusual combination in the Arabian Peninsula. The interior is mostly desert, and most of the coastline is barren. But the Dhofar region of Oman, specifically the site now known as Khor Karfot, matches the 12 specific markers precisely, including fertile, wooded, accessible from the interior desert route, and facing east toward the ocean. Researcher Warren Aston documented all of this in detail. The geography doesn't just give you a name, it requires a network of conditions to align simultaneously, which is a much harder thing to dismiss as coincidence than a place name alone. The chiasmus evidence that we've talked about before would be literary evidence, where ancient Hebrew poetry uses a structure where ideas are presented in sequence and then mirrored in reverse. And this pattern appears throughout the Book of Mormon several times in complex nested forms. People sometimes try to say that chiasmus is common enough that Joseph could have just picked it up. But the academic response is that the pattern in the Book of Mormon appears in passages that would be extraordinarily difficult to construct deliberately in literary forms that weren't even identified by scholars until 1967, 138 years after the book was published. Neither piece of evidence is individually decisive, but together with the theological convergence on the divine counsel and eternal matter, they form a pattern that becomes difficult to account for on the whole con man with no sources theory. Now, this episode is partly addressed to people who've already walked away from Christianity. What's the pattern there? Why do people leave, and why does it matter? Most people who leave Christianity seriously aren't leaving because something bad happened to them, though that definitely happens. But the more common pattern is that the internal logic just stops holding together. The pastor teaches one thing, the Bible says something else, the denomination requires doctrines built on Greek philosophical categories that the New Testament writers never used, and the canon was settled by councils whose authority that same tradition mostly doesn't accept in any other context. For example, Protestants generally reject Catholic consular authority. They don't accept the Council of Trent, Vatican I, or Vatican II. But the canon of scripture that they use was determined by earlier councils operating under that same Catholic ecclesiastical authority that they otherwise reject. The question of why that particular council decision gets grandfathered in while others don't is one that tends to go unasked in evangelical circles. But for most people, eventually enough threads like this have been pulled that the whole framework becomes kind of difficult to maintain honestly. Now, Bart Ehrman, agnostic New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, describes something close to this process across his work, particularly in Misquoting Jesus and Jesus Interrupted. He didn't lose his faith because of personal tragedy either. He followed the scholarship until the evangelical framework simply couldn't account for what the scholarship was actually showing. That's a different kind of deconversion entirely, and it's much harder to argue with because it isn't emotional. When people reach that point, they tend to land in one of two places. They stay with the Christianity that they were raised in, problems and all, or they let it go entirely. What they usually don't do is say, I'm going to go check out the Mormons, because critics have done an effective job of keeping it in the obviously worse than regular Christians category before anyone looks closely. The assumption is that if classical Christianity has problems, Mormonism has all those same problems plus some additional fluff. And we'll get to that, I promise, because it is wrong, and it's wrong in a specific and demonstrable way. But first, what do serious atheist philosophers actually find objectionable about classical Christianity? Not the popular version, but the careful philosophical one. There's a pretty big difference between the pop atheism of the early 2000s, like Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris, and the more rigorous philosophical tradition. The careful critics, running from David Hume through Bertrand Russell, through contemporary philosophers like J.L. Mackie and Graham Oppie, have identified specific structural problems with classical Christianity that just don't go away when you engage them seriously. The first is the problem of evil, and it chafes classical theism specifically because of creation ex nihilo, the idea that God created everything from literally nothing with no pre-existing matter and no external constraints. If that's true, God had unlimited options when designing this universe. So every earthquake, every child born into suffering, and every act of cruelty across the entire history of life on Earth was all chosen from an infinite range of alternatives with nothing constraining the choice. In other words, God chose it. The standard response ranges from free will to character building to the greater good, but they usually don't fully resolve the problem because they only address the moral evil. They don't address natural evil, like animal suffering before humans existed, or the question of why God would choose to create through a mechanism that requires suffering at all, when, by definition, he had cosmically unlimited alternatives. Classical theism has been working on an answer to this for centuries. J.L. Mackie laid out the logical form of the problem in 1955, and philosophers are still responding to it. The problem hasn't been resolved, it's just been managed. Now, the Trinity is a different structural issue. One God in three persons, each fully God and none greater than the others, yet somehow distinguishable. This was developed over 3 centuries of theological conflict using Greek philosophical terms that don't appear anywhere in the New Testament. The word homoousis, same substance, the term Nicaea settled on for the father-son relationship, is not anywhere in Scripture. Philosophers like Dale Tuggy at SUNY Fredonia have spent their careers demonstrating that the Nicene formulation can't be made logically coherent without first importing assumptions that then generate new contradictions. Just look at what Jesus himself said in John 17. He prays that his disciples may be one as we are one. If that oneness means ontologically identical substance, then every Christian is supposed to literally merge into each other and into God. Nobody reads it that way. The actual plain reading is unity of purpose, will, and love. But if that's what one means when Jesus prays for his disciples, then that's also what one means when he describes his relationship to the Father. The Trinity formulation requires you to apply 2 different definitions of the same word to 2 verses in the same prayer, because the alternative, being that Jesus is describing his relationship to the Father as relational rather than metaphysical, is actually the LDS position. Then there's the idea of eternal conscious torment. The word most often translated hell in the New Testament is Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom, actually a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem where fires burned constantly, and it was used as a metaphor for destruction and shame. Another word, though, is Hades, the Greek underworld, and a waiting place, but decidedly not a torture chamber. Tartarus, the actual bad place, appears exactly once, and only when referring to imprisoned angels. The doctrine of eternal conscious torment, as most people understand it today, with unending conscious suffering decided for the majority of humanity, was really developed largely by Augustine in the 5th century. It wasn't read out of the New Testament text with fresh eyes at all. It was read back into a text whose actual vocabulary doesn't straightforwardly support it. Alex O'Connor puts the philosophical objection to this plainly when he says, "No finite action justifies infinite punishment, and a God described as perfectly loving, who nevertheless designed eternal conscious torment, is a contradiction in terms that no amount of theological qualification resolves." These are the actual philosophical and theological objections, big and specific structural problems in the philosophical architecture of classical Christianity. And they all matter here because when you look at what LDS theology does, the picture starts to change, in some cases even eliminating the problem entirely. So, Sam Harris, back to him, says that Mormonism is Christianity plus implausible things. So what does LDS theology actually remove, and what does it replace it with? Harris's argument does have an intuitive logic. If you're already skeptical that Jesus rose from the dead, adding golden plates and a 19th century prophet doesn't make the package more credible. More claims means more to doubt. It's a totally reasonable first instinct. The problem is that it assumes LDS theology is an extension of classical Christianity, with the same foundation, just with more floors built on top. But that's not what the restoration is. The Restoration didn't add to classical Christianity, it replaced the foundation. And specifically, it replaced it with something closer to what the ancient sources, including all the ones that we've talked about on this show, actually tell us. Start with creation ex nihilo. Gerhard May, a German Protestant theologian who wrote the definitive academic study on this, documented that ex nihilo was a 2nd century invention and not something read out of Genesis 1. The earliest Christian writers didn't teach it either, which matters because it means that ex nihilo isn't apostolic, meaning that it wasn't passed down from Jesus or the original apostles. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, explicitly said that God created from pre-existing matter. The creation ex nihilo doctrine was finally introduced by Theophilus of Antioch around 180 AD, and Irenaeus shortly after, but only as a philosophical response to Gnostic dualism, not an exegesis of Genesis. It then became official Catholic dogma only at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 AD. The overall disagreement among early Christian writers proves that ex nihilo was not handed down from the apostles. It was a doctrine that developed, was contested, and was eventually imposed. The text itself also doesn't support it. Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, before God begins his organizing work, describes the earth as tohu wabohu, formless and empty, with the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. That's a clear picture of pre-existing unorganized matter, not absolute nothing. The Hebrew word bara in Genesis 1 verse 1 doesn't require creation from nothing. What it describes is a creative act that can mean organizing or shaping what's already there, and that's how it's actually used throughout the Bible. The LDS position that God organized eternal elements isn't a 19th century invention. It's what Justin Martyr taught, it's what Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 implies, and it's what the first law of thermodynamics is consistent with. Matter and energy are neither created nor destroyed. Remove ex nihilo, and you change the character of the problem of evil fundamentally. But under ex nihilo, God had unlimited options with no constraints, so every instance of suffering is a direct design choice from a blank slate. Under LDS eternal matter, the suffering and mortality simply reflects the constraints of a process, not unconstrained omnipotent preference. The second big removal is the Trinity. We believe in the Godhead instead, meaning God the Father and Jesus Christ are distinct, separate, embodied beings. The Holy Ghost is a distinct personage of spirit. And they are 3 beings unified in purpose, will, and love, but not 3 persons of one substance. When you describe that to a trained philosopher, the typical Christian paradox disappears, because the claim isn't that 3 persons are literally one being while also being 3. Dale Tuggy, not LDS, has argued in peer-reviewed philosophy of religion that the social trinity, meaning divine unity understood as relational rather than metaphysical, is the most defensible Trinitarian position available. Whether he knows it or not, what he's describing as the best option is structurally what the LDS Church has taught since 1830. And the third removal is eternal conscious torment, hell. Our 3 degrees of glory mean that virtually everyone ends up in a state that exceeds anything that mortality offered. The outer darkness that we have is reserved for sons of perdition, which is a category requiring a specific, deliberate, fully informed rejection of truth that the Church itself has always been hesitant to define. Thomas Talbot at Willamette University argued from within Christian philosophy that universal reconciliation is the only position consistent with genuine divine love. And evangelical scholars John Stott and Clark Pinnock argued for annihilation. When serious Christian thinkers are publicly abandoning eternal torment on philosophical grounds, they're arriving at a problem that LDS theology simply never had. So when Harris says that Mormonism is Christianity plus, what he's actually describing is a framework that returned to the pre-creedal, pre-edited theological baseline and replaced the later philosophical imports with something that matches both the ancient sources and the conclusions that serious thinkers keep arriving at independently. That's not actually a longer list of claims. That's a totally different foundation. Now, critics say that Latter-day Saints worship a different Jesus. What do we do with that? The different Jesus objection is usually meant to end the conversation before it starts as some sort of a trump card. They say that if the LDS Jesus is so different from the Christian Jesus, then Mormonism isn't really Christianity at all. But after what we've just covered on the channel, the question now runs the other direction. The question isn't whether the LDS Jesus differs from the creedal Jesus, because he does, and that's not in dispute. The question is which description is actually grounded in the New Testament text before the councils began their work. The Jesus in the New Testament prays to the Father as a distinct person, and says the Father is greater than him. He asks why God has forsaken him. He receives authority, he grows in wisdom, and he's exalted. Philippians 2 says God gave Jesus the name above all names after the resurrection. But Jesus is the unchanging God, right? You don't receive what you've always possessed eternally. And Acts chapter 2, verse 36, Peter's first sermon at Pentecost, the earliest Christological statement that we have, says, God has made this Jesus, both Lord and Messiah. So God exalting Jesus. Let's look at that last one. The Greek word is epoiēsen, made or appointed or caused to be. Critics sometimes say that this means declared or revealed, and that God was simply revealing a status that Jesus always had. But that reading requires importing your Nicene assumptions into a pre-Nicene text. In actual plain reading context, Peter is making an argument to a Jewish audience about what the resurrection demonstrates, that God acted to exalt Jesus to a position of lordship. That's clear exaltation language, and it assumes a clear sequence, before the resurrection and after the resurrection. Something changed. That's not at all compatible with co-eternal, co-equal divinity. And this isn't my reading or just Bart Ehrman's idiosyncratic reading as an agnostic. The diversity of early Christology, including adoptionist and exaltation views that predate Nicene theology, is the actual mainstream position in academic New Testament scholarship across the theological spectrum. Period. Richard Bachman, a conservative evangelical scholar, documents the same diversity of early Christological views even while reaching different conclusions from it. Ehrman is just one well-known voice among many others pointing in the same direction. The creedal Jesus was not recovered from the New Testament. He was constructed at councils over centuries using philosophical tools that the New Testament writers didn't use. So, when someone says we worship a different Jesus, they're mostly right, because we're working from the framework of the New Testament text before the Neoplatonic categories were imported. But the critics are still measuring us against a standard that it took centuries of disagreements to produce, and then treating that as the ancient original standard. Dale Tuggy, analytic philosopher of religion, again, not LDS, has argued that the LDS description of Christ is actually more philosophically coherent and more consistent with the New Testament text. That's another outside observer following the argument, and still not someone making a case for the church. So, is this pattern even wider than what I've covered today, or is it just pretty isolated to this? Emerson Green said something along these lines. If I didn't become a Mormon, but I did somehow convert to some form of Christianity, I'd probably just reinvent about 70% of Mormonism and then technically not be a Mormon. All of this because he followed the philosophy from outside the tradition and arrived at something that looks like LDS theology. So, short answer, this is not an isolated case. Not only have we covered a huge spread of scholars since the beginning of this channel, but we also have David Ray Griffin, Professor Emeritus at Claremont School of Theology, who concluded that finite theism, or a God who works within eternal law rather than above it, is the only intellectually honest answer to the problem of evil. His 1976 book, God, Power, and Evil, made the argument decades before LDS apologists were framing it in those terms, with no engagement with LDS theology. And we have Greg Boyd and Clark Pinnock, coming from evangelical biblical study, who concluded that a God genuinely constrained by eternal relationship is more consistent with Scripture than classical omnipotence. And then they were pushed to the margins of evangelical Christianity for saying it. And we also have Philip Goff at Durham University, who moved from atheism toward theism because the fine-tuning of the universe's physical constraints point toward a life-centered purpose that atheism can't account for. Most importantly, Goff's move is specifically toward a God who works within mathematical law rather than above it, because the physical constraints are themselves the structure, not just free choices made from a blank slate. A God who simply chose those constraints from unlimited alternatives faces the same arbitrariness problem as ex nihilo creation, and that's the connection to LDS cosmology. eternal law that God works within rather than authors, which is structurally more compatible with what the physics actually shows than with classical omnipotent creation from nothing. Finally today, we have Alex O'Connor, Oxford philosophy and theology graduate and host of the Within Reason podcast, who has engaged LDS theology directly through the Jubilee format and a follow-up conversation with Jacob Hansen from Thoughtful Faith. And he acknowledged the LDS framework offers a more defensible answer to the problem of evil than classical Christianity. Someone now might correctly point out that this convergence on finite theism doesn't prove the LDS Church is true. That's correct. Lots of people could converge on similar conclusions about God's nature without concluding that Joseph Smith was a prophet. But that's not the argument. The argument today is that the convergence dismantles the Harris framing specifically. It shows that the doctrinal positions that the Restoration occupies are positions that serious thinkers keep arriving at independently, which means that these most likely aren't the novelties of a con man. They're the conclusions of careful inquiry reached from multiple independent directions. Now, whether Joseph Smith reached them by revelation or by some other means is a separate question. But the idea that they're obviously invented additions to an otherwise credible Christianity is just wrong. At the end of the day, these people aren't talking to each other, and they're not trying to help us. They're following philosophy, biblical theology, and physics, and just arriving at structurally similar conclusions. And my own road through ancient history and archaeology led to the same place. What this convergence establishes is not that the church is true, but it establishes that the doctrinal framework that the Restoration occupies is where serious independent inquiry keeps arriving. So just understand that that's the ground that we're standing on before we cover what I think is probably the hardest remaining objection. So what's the LDS answer to the problem of something like animal suffering? The version that philosophers say is the hardest to answer, and I agree. Emerson Green and Alex O'Connor both point to animal suffering during evolution, hundreds of millions of years of predation and death before any human being existed, as being the hardest version of this problem for finite theism. Paul Draper at Purdue University has pressed this carefully, saying that the distribution of pain and pleasure in the natural world tracks biological fitness, not moral purpose. The pattern is more consistent with atheism than with any form of theism. So let's talk about it. The key logical move that finite theism makes is this. Under classical theism, God had absolutely no constraints. So if God is omnipotent in the classical sense and created from nothing, then every feature of this universe, including all of its suffering, is a direct choice from a blank slate with no limits. God chose all of this. But under LDS finite theism, God works within eternal law that he didn't author. Things like the laws of physics, logic, and mathematics are eternal and not created. And if the laws of biology that govern the development of embodied, mortal, growth-capable beings capable of genuine deification, which is the LDS belief that humans can become like God in nature and character, require an evolutionary process, then the suffering embedded in that process reflects the constraints of the mechanism, not the preference of an all-omnipotent designer choosing freely among all possible worlds. That's a very different solve for the same suffering. We don't say God has mysterious reasons or suffering is good for you, but God didn't design this from unlimited options. He worked within a structure that he didn't author. Now, David Ray Griffin argued this from process philosophy, and Harold Kushner, a rabbi who wrote his most well-known book while grieving his teenage son's death from a rare genetic disease, also arrived at finite theism from Jewish theology and personal experience, independently and decades earlier. Is that a fully satisfying answer? Probably not. There's still a question about why the eternal constraints are structured the way that they are, and whether a God working within them might have found a less costly path. Unfortunately, LDS theology doesn't claim to have resolved this, but some Christian apologetics traditions treat every objection as if it's already answered, every philosophical difficulty as resolved, and every critic is simply just confused. But that's not what careful or honest thinkers do, and it's not what this channel is about. So, what the LDS framework offers is a meaningfully different account of the problem, one that actually relocates suffering from being a chosen design feature of an all-powerful being to being the cost of a constrained process. That's the real difference, even without the whole answer. and you should be taking it seriously before concluding that no framework can do better than classical theism. So I've laid out a basic intellectual case, but where did the road actually end for me? I spent years in the gap trying to dismantle different forms of classical Christianity through the evidence and not yet having found a framework that matched what the ancient sources actually showed. When I finally looked seriously at LDS theology, it wasn't actually Christianity with extra claims layered on. It was a reconstruction of what the ancient sources had been pointing to all along. I was just finding it in the scholarship long before I ever found it in the church. And I want to cover the "you already found what you were looking for" criticism because I know that that's coming. Again, I wasn't looking for the LDS Church, and I wasn't evaluating Joseph Smith. I wasn't even interested in Christianity. I was actually more interested in things like the ancient Mesopotamians, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and even Hinduism. But I started following the archaeological and textual record of the ancient world because the ancient world doesn't care what you want to find. And what kept showing up in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Ugaritic texts and in the work of scholars across every tradition was a theological picture that I wasn't expecting and that I wasn't looking for. The LDS Church wasn't my starting point. It was where the evidence kept pointing. Now, when I finally engaged in this religion personally, after all the intellectual work was done, I had my own experience where something confirmed it in a way that wasn't scholarship. I'm not going to dress it up or try to make it more dramatic or spiritual than it was, and in fact, we'll just keep moving. But just know that the evidence got me to the door, even though I wasn't exactly sure what the door was until I walked through it. I don't expect any of that to function as an argument for a skeptic. It shouldn't, and I personally wouldn't trust it if that was the argument. But I would be leaving out the most important part of my own story if I didn't say that I had a spiritual witness, and I believe that you can too. So for someone who isn't LDS and has no intention of becoming LDS, what should they actually take away from this? You don't have to agree with the LDS conclusions, and you don't have to accept the Book of Mormon, the Restoration, Joseph Smith, any of it. It's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is whether you've engaged the actual evidence or whether you've been working from a caricature. Now, I cover this caricature in basically every single episode, but it goes something like this. Joseph Smith, a 19th century farmer and con man with no education and no sources, invented an entirely new religion from scratch, and then he made up a collection of theological new ideas to fill it out, and somehow convinced people to follow him. But that picture requires you to ignore what people like Gerhard May documented about ex nihilo, and what Michael Heiser found in the Hebrew Bible, and what Emmanuel Tove confirmed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what Bart Ehrman documented about early Christology, what German archaeologists found in Yemen in the late 1990s, and what Emerson, Green, and Alex O'Connor concluded when they actually followed the philosophy, as well as all of the others mentioned and not mentioned. What it requires is that all of those independent findings across theology, textual scholarship, archaeology, and philosophy must be wrong or just irrelevant. Now, the LDS theological framework isn't a collection of ideas that Joseph invented. It's a reconstruction of what the oldest sources actually describe, being arrived at independently by scholars in multiple fields who weren't looking for it. You can think the church is wrong. You can even think Joseph Smith was mistaken. But to maintain the whole con man inventing novelties narrative while also ignoring the precedent that all these scholars have established isn't even skepticism. And the evidence deserves much better than that. So here's where this all lands for today. Sam Harris's framing, Mormonism is Christianity plus implausible things, therefore it's obviously worse, has functioned as a conversation stopper for a very long time. But the people who actually did the philosophical work and who actually read the critics and the defenses and followed the arguments keep arriving somewhere that the framing can't account for. Emerson Green concluded that following philosophy of religion honestly tends to produce something that looks like LDS theology. Alex O'Connor engaged the framework directly and acknowledged that it's more defensible on the problem of evil. David Ray Griffin concluded from process philosophy that finite theism is the only honest answer to suffering. Dale Tuggy argued that the social trinity is the most philosophically defensible Trinitarian position available. Bart Ehrman documented that early Christology looked far more like LDS theology than Nicene theology. And Greg Boyd and Clark Pinnock concluded from biblical study that a relational God working within eternal law is more consistent with the actual text. None of them are LDS, and none of them had a reason to say any of this. My own road ran through the ancient Near Eastern record, through Genesis 1 that describes God organizing existing matter rather than conjuring it from nothing, through the realization that the God of the oldest sources looked nothing like the God of the councils. I wasn't looking for the church, I was just looking for what actually happened. And here's the big thing. You don't have to agree with where the evidence points, and you don't have to accept LDS conclusions. But if your picture of this church still relies on a conman farm boy idea, and your response to Heiser, Tove, May, Ehrman, and Griffin is to just dismiss or ignore them, then you're just defending a story. It's not an accusation, it's just the same question that I had to ask myself before I was willing to look at any of this honestly. For LDS viewers watching, just understand that you don't have to defend LDS theology against the standard of Nicaea. Nicaea isn't the standard. The original text is. And the original theology of the ancient world is. By those standards, the critics are defending the later import, not the original. So when someone tells you that Mormons believe in a different Jesus, ask them, which Jesus? The one in the Bible, or the one that took centuries of councils to formalize? Philosophers, historians, and New Testament scholars with no stake in your testimony have all documented that gap. Use their work. For skeptics watching, the question isn't whether you're joining the LDS Church. The question is whether you've actually looked at the argument or whether you've just been running a caricature. Emerson Green looked, Alex O'Connor looked, Bart Ehrman, David Ray Griffin, and Dale Tuggy all looked from their own disciplines. Their conclusions don't require you to believe anything, but they do require you to engage honestly before just dismissing. If the LDS position is wrong, it should be possible to show that while also acknowledging the evidence. If you can only dismiss it by ignoring the evidence, then you should really re-examine your own position. For anyone curious outside that's watching, the LDS Church isn't asking you to accept a less rational version of Christianity. We're asking you to examine a pre-Christian version that removed the philosophical problems that the big thinkers today find the most difficult, and we replace them with a framework that those same thinkers keep independently reconstructing when they follow the plain evidence. The restoration isn't Christianity with additions. It's actually closer to what predates the Greek philosophical imports. It's the version that matches the ancient texts and the ancient traditions, and the place that honest inquiry keeps arriving at. You don't have to accept that, but it's worth knowing that it exists. All of my sources are in the pinned comment. I'm Alex Arnold. This is Moroni Standard.